Hey guys, it's Mr. H here, and we're going to have a short little chat about how points work in a distributor. So there's probably another video somewhere here on the main page that actually tells you how a distributor works, where they came from, where they first started. But in today's video, this is going to be strictly talking about how the point systems work. Now on the point systems, just understand we are on the primary side of the circuit. We are not on the secondary, so we're talking about just our regular run-of-the-mill 12.6 volts coming from the battery. On the primary side, what we're doing is we're controlling when that field collapses inside of our coil. So we're going to saturate this guy with voltage as well as determine when to open that circuit to initialize that collapse of the magnetic field, which transfers to the secondary windings, giving us our kV that then goes to the spark plug. So the bottom portion of a distributor is the primary side. The top portion, once we get to the cap and rotor, that's when we get to the secondary side. But we're going to talk about the primary side, which is going to be this bottom portion right here. Now we have our vacuum advance on here, but that's a conversation for a different time. Right now I just want to focus on how points actually work and why you hear all the old heads like, I remember when we used to replace and dial in points and stuff like that. Well, now we're going to find out how it actually works. Now, back to some of the basics. Your distributor is going to run off of most likely the camshaft or off the index off the oil pump, which is still going to run off of the pretty much the driven system of the engine no matter what. So on this one you can see we just have this little like flathead index key that would go into the index at the top of the oil pump in this vehicle. But on some other vehicles it might not only just have that, but it also might go strictly on the side of the camshaft with a helical gear to actually make this guy actually turn. Now, when we're talking about points, what are we talking about is instead of having, let's say, what we have now known as an ignition module. Now, they're not as big as this. It's just PCM, new cars. Before we had an ignition module that took care of all of that, we have what we call points. So we had a physical switch, a contact switch that actually opened and closed to actually turn this guy on and then open the circuit to make it collapse the field and generate kV out of the secondary windings. We actually had to mechanically make that happen before we had an ignition control module. Mr. H, how to do that? Here's how they did that. All right, so notice on this distributor I have a wire here, and this wire, where it would go would be on the coil itself. So you'd have one going from the battery post to the coil, so you'd have your 12-volt source, and then this would be on the other side, on the negative post, much like this. You'd have one coming from the battery to positive post on the coil, and then this guy going to the distributor itself. Now notice it's just one wire, so it's a series circuit. Series meaning, if you open it up, whole thing goes out, right? So what you have is, if you follow the wire inside the distributor, and I'll try to make sure I get this as best as I can on the camera, what you get is you notice that inside here, and I'm going to try my best so you guys can see it, there is this cammed lobe. So it's an eccentric cam, well, not an eccentric, but it's a cam, because you can see all these high points that are on it, and you can see, and depending on how many cylinders your vehicle has, that is going to make up how many corners that cam has. Because remember, we need to send a spark for every cylinder. We didn't even get to the firing order. That happens up here. But here we need a spark for every cylinder. So we need that circuit to open up every time I need to induce a spark to produce that kV. So on here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this came off of an 8-cylinder engine. And now let's see what else we got. Well, we've got a condenser. Okay, just in case we have, some sort of issue where the voltage is either a little bit irregular or we have a voltage spike so it can absorb that. So that's one thing we have right here. Another thing you'll notice we have is this sort of arm, this lever that actually rides off of the lobe. Now, let's talk about what the whole point of this video is points. Our points are right here. So we have one point here, and then we have another point on this mechanical arm. And what happens is, as this camshaft spins and spins the bottom of the distributor, you can see right there that as I reach the top portion of each one of those lobes, you can see that it opens up that circuit just for a second there. So there you go. Just a little bit, and boom, you can see the arm actually, you can see air gap between there, and then it closes again. Now, the time that it stays closed, that's going to be my dwell period. But when we open up here, that's the point where we open up that circuit and we induce that magnetic field to collapse in the coil, creating the spark. So notice, every corner, I have 8 corners for, 8 cylinders. I need 8 sparks. And the one thing I could tell you, the reason why this one is probably in the bucket and the reason why it probably failed is because I noticed while spinning this, I actually adjusted the points, and I'll talk about how you do that, but I could adjust it just by this little set screw here. That's a Phillips head. I have it wound in the whole way, and the one thing I notice is I have some where it's a nice air gap. You would measure this with a feeler gauge if you were adjusting these points. So right there I got a nice break in the circuit, but some of these I can tell that a few of these on the lobe have worn out over time. So some of them you can see that, like right there, this lobe ain't doing jack squat. Those 2 lobes right there, they're pretty much worn out. They're rounded off. So that would be, 2 cylinders right there that probably wouldn't fire because there is not a break. The circuit's not breaking there. But as you move on to some of the lobes that aren't worn as much, then there, boom, we got a nice gap. But I can tell you the reason why this one failed and is why it's in the trash bin is because it wore out. And there's nothing else I can do with the adjustment on here. So let me show you how I would adjust points. I don't have a feeler gauge on me right now, but if I were to do this, let's say it's a tune-up on a vehicle, and I want to make sure, the carburetor, it's jetted right, everything's correct. I have a nice idle, as well as I'm checking my timing, with a timing light, making sure this is indexed right. But if I'm also adjusting points, or I'm replacing points, because just like any contact area that can open and close, with this open and closing, what can happen is misalignment between the points. You could have them wear out, you can have them burn up, get burnt, micro weld to each other, a whole bunch of things, just as any parts that would, wear over time, like including, like the lobe surface there. Those corners can slowly just round out, just like what we just saw right there, where no longer at the top of the hill where it's supposed to open the circuit and induce a spark. There was 2 lobes there that you saw that even with this adjusted the full way down, it wasn't opening. So that tells me right there. But if I were to adjust this, let's say if this was in a vehicle and I wanted to, let's say, set points or adjust points on a car, what I would do is I would look up spec-wise what's acceptable for the clearance when you are on that hill, when that point is opened, and I would take a feeler gauge and I would check that air gap between there, make sure it's within spec. It can't be too small, it can't be too large. It's got to go within the parameters of what the manufacturer says. Now, the way you would adjust that is you can see that this little flathead screw right there, this holds this, and what this does is if you're moving this, you can actually adjust. Now, right now you see the whole assembly is moving, but based on where this cam lobe is, if I were to lock this down, that would pretty much tell me how I'm going to set the points gaps between. So right there, that I'm pretty much have nothing in there. And this is all the adjustment I have to take up here. So this is extremely worn. But on this one, I can tell you I'm going to need a new set of points. I'm going to need this whole entire arm and the shaft replaced. So at this point, it just needs a distributor because it's worn. But I have this. You can see here's like full up, here's full down. I'm going to hold it down as far as it can go. So I was trying to get, the closest I could get. Let's say if it was way out, I hit a huge gap, I would tighten this thing as far down as I can. So that means it would be as close to the cam lobe as can be. And you can still tell that, good there, and then I get to those 2 lobes where nothing happens. So once again, let me get to the nicer ones, like right here, right there, while it's open, that's when I would put my feeler gauge in, and I'd see what that gap is. But I would keep going, and then you could see like right here, these 2 lobes, they're so rounded off that they're just dead spots. They are not opening up. They're not going to cause that spark to happen for whatever 2 cylinders that may be out of the 8. So that would be a miss, a dead miss for both of those. You can see that that's fully adjusted, but that's all there really is to spark. You're also concentrating on dwell with usually a scope or something like that. But that's all that points do. All it was the precursor before we just had a computer decide to do it for us. There's a couple of things in between as far as, you know, where we started to involve electronics in some distributors. So those are points. Some vehicles have 2 sets of points. Some can even have more than that, depending on how crazy the manufacturer was. But what you can see on here is another version. Now this one's a little bent out of shape, but this one is using sort of like magnetic pickup or a Hall effect sensor. So you can see instead of having anything that's mechanical, it's just going off of, okay, see how many we have. This is an 8-cylinder as well. And you can see there is just this bar here that is picking up that close field as it spins. So that's sort of going in the same direction. You can see as we graduated through some of the more advanced ones, you'll have similar setups and things like that. But here's another one. It's a little hard to see because it still has the top portion for the advance. But if I were to spin this, same deal. So there are the points, the contact points right there. I don't know if you can see them right there. As I'm spinning them, you can see as it runs off that cam lobe, you can see every time. So spark, 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 spark. So that's how that was used in older vehicles. Before we had fancy electronics and fancy computers, we had points. And they were things that would wear out over time. They would need to be replaced. They would need to be adjusted. They need to be checked. So that was the basic part of maintenance / tune-up on a vehicle of that age. So we still deal with them. Some of your car, you know, your older parents or grandparents' cars, you're going to see that on there. It was a common practice back in the day. It wasn't anything new, and it was something that everyone was kind of used to or was very familiar with. But that's where it first started. We didn't have any electronics that could do very much, so we had to mechanically make a switch that opened and closed that circuit on the coil side to induce that spark. So once again, that is on the primary side. That is just on the 12.6 volt side. Going through the bottom portion of the distributor is controlling the spark that'll eventually go to the top part of the distributor, which will be in a separate video where we talk about a cap and a rotor and how they work in tandem to send the spark where it needs to go. That's Mr. H, and that's a short 13-minute video on points.